So Kirk Cousins, a couple of touchdown passes. The other news, Carolina Panthers have benched Bryce Young, and Andy Dalton will be the starting quarterback as we bring in Scott Fowler. Scott works for the Charlotte Observer, sports columnist for the last 30 years, and he joins us on the program. Scott, it's the annual Let's Have Scott Fowler on to talk about how bad the Panthers are. So how did we get to this point?
Well, short story is that the Panthers were 2-15 last year, and somehow they've gotten even worse. They're started off 0-2, but not only that, Dan, they've gotten blown out twice. It's 73-13 after two games in total points. So they made a big move yesterday.
Okay, who's the one who benched Bryce Young?
I think that's Dave Canales, but he certainly had a lot of input because he was very hesitant to answer that question yesterday. But I think ultimately this is his call. He was brought in to resurrect Bryce Young, Dan, and instead now after two games, they've benched him.
Okay, what is missing there with Bryce Young?
He seems to me like he's overwhelmed and undersized. Those two things together are just working against him. Even in the best of times, he's undersized, right? But Drew Brees and Russell Wilson made that work, so it can happen. But to me, the reason they drafted him number one, Dan, was because they thought his brain was a computer and he would process everything beautifully and always make the right throw and throw it accurately. And that would make up for any other things. What's happened, however, is I think his confidence is shot. Yeah. And so because of that, he's just making poor decisions all over the place.
Was he set up for failure?
I thought last year he was. I didn't think they had enough around him, and especially not his offensive line. But honestly, right now, Dan, they're blocking pretty well. I mean, in this last game, he was not pressured that much at all, but he just kept taking the 2-yard check down on 3rd and 10. It was like he was so worried about getting sacked and throwing a pick that he played the other way, just this ultra conservative way, and got booed, Dan, more than I've covered this team 30 years. I've never seen a home opener where the fans booed like that.
And I think, what did he have, 18 completions, but not even 90 yards? I mean, that tells you everything of, let me just get the ball out. But you don't have playmakers to get the ball out, too. So I understand you're not even getting out of first gear here. But go back to the draft. Because David Tepper, I'm going to guess, from Mount Olympus came down and said, we're taking him and we're going to trade our best receiver. And I mean, this is a mess. But is this the right decision to move on? Are they moving on from Bryce Young?
I kind of think that they are until Andy Dalton either shows them otherwise or, gets hurt. And that's certainly a possibility, too. I think we'll see Bryce play again. But are they moving on? This sure feels symbolic to me. 2 games into the season. And yet, Dan, I will say, and I've written in the Charlotte Observer, I think it is the right move. I mean, how big of a sample size do you need when a guy's gone 2-16 over 18 starts? And in those 18 starts, Dan, like 10 of them, he's thrown 0 touchdown passes. So it's just, they just don't score with him behind the wheel.
Scott Fowler, Charlotte Observer, sports columnist for the last 30 years. Will David Tepper talk this week, the owner?
We'd love him to. I would guess not. He's been very behind the scenes, Dan, for most of 2024, and so we just don't know if he's the wizard behind the curtain here on these decisions. I'm sure he's consulted on all of them, but the one that just keeps resonating here, of course, is they see C.J. Stroud lighting it up every single week, and they could have had him. And of course, even Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold, who started here, are both 2-0 right now. I mean, Matt Rule is 3-0 in Nebraska. I mean, it's going. It's just everyone. I think it's us, Dan. Somehow, I think it's this city. It's us. We're cursed.
But I've said this before, Scott. If C.J. Stroud was on Carolina, they wouldn't be any better. And if Bryce Young played for the Texans, we might see a different Bryce Young. If you don't have an offensive line, if you don't have a couple of playmakers, you're not going to succeed. I don't care how good you are.
Yeah, no, you're right. They set him up for failure for sure last year, and I thought this year they really tried to make it better. It's still not much better, but I really honestly think most of it is on Bryce right now. I mean, they've got a pretty good offensive line actually right now, way better than last year. They ran the ball very well, or for them
Yeah.
on Sunday, but they could never make a 3rd and 2. I mean, it was just it was ridiculous, really.
Okay, but Andy Dalton got a start last year.
He did one
Okay.
start. Yeah.
Has he thrown? I think you might have pointed this out. Did he throw for more yards in that game than Bryce has thrown this year?
Right, and that was with a worse cast of receivers. He threw for 361. They still lost, but he had the best game any Panther quarterback had last year came when Andy Dalton played that one game for Bryce, and they put him right back on the bench. I mean, obviously he's 36 years old, Dan. He came out in the same draft class as Cam Newton, as people around here will point out. But in the short term, I mean, he's clearly the better player.
All right, let's fast forward to next year's NFL draft. The Carolina Panthers on the clock. What did they do with the number one overall pick?
Well, I think that would be a good scenario for them. I mean, right now, I think getting number one again and not having to trade their way to it would be great. And I think they'll pick a quarterback. I think honestly that they'll start over here and try it again. Isn't that amazing? But yeah, I think that's the way it's going to go.
All right.
And you and I'll be talking about it in April.
I'll talk to you again in April when when they're on the clock. Scott, great to talk to you again. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dan.
Scott Fowler, he's seen it all, covered it all, 30 years, and had not heard the building that loud booing Bryce Young this past weekend.